They said she was dying, but her eyes were screaming. Rebecca Ashford lay trapped behind glass walls while 20 doctors debated her fate, her steel empire bleeding billions as machines forced air into her lungs. The finest medical minds in America whispered about brain death and legal guardianship, clipboards scratching against starched coats. Then Daniel Foster stepped into the sterile fluorescent glow, mop bucket wheels squeaking against polished marble. His weathered hands trembled on the door handle. 3 years of invisible labor in these halls had taught him to read the language others missed, the desperate flutter beneath her closed eyelids, the way her breathing changed when familiar voices spoke her name. In the suffocating silence of room 314, he realized the terrible truth that would destroy everything they believed about saving lives. Daniel's reflection wavered in the polished floor as he pushed his cart past the intensive care unit. The sharp smell of disinfectant couldn't mask the underlying scent of fear that clung to these walls like morning fog. Room 314 pulsed with artificial light, casting shadows that danced across expensive medical equipment worth more than most people's homes. Inside, Rebecca Ashford's chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, her face pale as winter snow against the stark white pillows. The monitors beeped their steady rhythm, a digital heartbeat that had become the soundtrack to her family's nightmare. Daniel paused outside the door, his fingers tightening around the worn plastic handle of his mop. 6-year-old Noah Foster sat cross-legged in the hospital waiting area, his tablet balanced on his knees as he traced invisible patterns in the air. Other families whispered around him, their voices creating a low hum that seemed to vibrate through the uncomfortable plastic chairs. His father worked somewhere in this maze of corridors, pushing silence through halls where hope and despair collided like opposing storms. Noah's eyes tracked the movement of doctors in their pristine white coats, noting how they walked faster past certain rooms, how their shoulders tensed when conversations grew too quiet. The boy had learned to read the language of adults through their unspoken gestures, the way his autism had taught him to see patterns others couldn't comprehend. The tablet screen reflected the fluorescent lights above as Noah switched between apps, his small fingers moving with practiced precision. He had been coming to St. Mary's Medical Center for 3 months now, ever since his father took the evening cleaning shift to accommodate his school schedule. The routine never changed. Dinner at 5:30, homework by 6:15, then the drive through Riverside Falls to the hospital, where Dad disappeared into the labyrinth of rooms and emerged hours later smelling like industrial soap and exhaustion. Tonight felt different, though, like the moment before thunder, when the air grows heavy with unspoken promises. Daniel's footsteps echoed against the marble floors as he approached room 314, each sound sharp and deliberate in the hushed atmosphere. Through the glass partition, he could see Dr. Crawford consulting with 2 specialists, their heads bent over charts that documented Rebecca Ashford's mysterious condition. The woman's dark hair spread across the pillow like spilled ink, her manicured fingers resting motionless on the starched white sheets. For 72 hours, she had remained in this twilight state between consciousness and oblivion, her vital signs stable but her mind unreachable. The medical team had exhausted every conventional treatment, every experimental protocol, every desperate theory that might explain her unresponsive condition. "Excuse me," a woman's voice cut through the mechanical humming of the life support equipment. Daniel turned to see an elegantly dressed stranger standing near the nurse's station, her designer handbag clutched against her side like armor. She wore the kind of expensive clothing that whispered rather than shouted wealth, a navy blazer that probably cost more than Daniel's monthly salary, shoes that clicked against the floor with authority. But her eyes betrayed something the expensive facade couldn't hide, a raw vulnerability that made her seem suddenly fragile despite her polished appearance. "You work here, don't you?" "I'm Helen Patterson. I'm here about Rebecca Ashford." Daniel nodded slowly, studying the woman's face for clues he couldn't quite name. Helen's makeup had been applied with care, but he could see the faint traces of tears that had been hastily wiped away, the slight tremor in her hands as she adjusted her grip on the leather strap. She moved like someone carrying an invisible weight, her posture perfect but her breathing shallow and controlled. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows under her eyes, emphasizing the exhaustion that no amount of concealer could completely mask. There was something familiar about her features, a subtle resemblance that nagged at the edges of his consciousness like a half-remembered dream. "I need to ask you something," Helen continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You've been cleaning these floors for a while, haven't you? You see things that others miss." She glanced toward room 314, where the medical team continued their hushed consultation. "My daughter is 8 years old. When she's scared, she gets very quiet, but her eyes, they tell you everything you need to know. Sometimes I think adults forget how to read that language." Her fingers worried the edges of her purse strap, twisting the leather into tight spirals before releasing it again. The gesture spoke of nervous energy barely contained, of secrets pressing against carefully constructed boundaries. Daniel found himself drawn into Helen's orbit despite his better judgment. There was something about her carefully modulated voice, the way she chose her words with surgical precision, that reminded him of the clients he used to work with back when he designed aircraft systems. People who spoke in layers, who communicated as much through what they didn't say as through their actual words. "Your daughter," he said carefully. "Does she see patterns that others don't?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither of them fully understood yet. Helen's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of recognition passing across her features like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "How did you know that?" Helen's voice carried a note of surprise that she quickly tried to suppress. "Olivia has always been perceptive. She notices when people are pretending to be happy, when they're hiding something important. Last week she asked me why I was sad, even though I was smiling." The admission seemed to cost her something, as if acknowledging her daughter's insight meant confessing to her own carefully maintained deceptions. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, a small movement that betrayed the tension she was trying so hard to conceal. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, filled with the constant background symphony of medical equipment and muffled conversations. Noah appeared at Daniel's elbow with the silent precision of a shadow, his tablet tucked against his chest like a shield. The boy's arrival seemed to startle Helen, who took an instinctive step backward before catching herself. "This is my son Noah," Daniel explained, resting a protective hand on the child's shoulder. Noah studied Helen with the intense focus he reserved for particularly interesting puzzles, his head tilted slightly to one side as he processed the visual information she presented. The fluorescent lights caught the gold flecks in his brown eyes, making them seem to glow with an inner light that spoke of intelligence far beyond his 6 years. "You're not really here to visit someone," Noah said matter-of-factly, his voice carrying the blunt honesty that children wielded like precision instruments. "You're here because you're scared about something, but you don't want anyone to know." Helen's carefully composed expression cracked around the edges, revealing glimpses of the raw emotion she had been working so hard to contain. The boy's observation hung in the sterile air like a challenge, impossible to ignore or deflect. Daniel felt the familiar surge of pride mixed with worry that always accompanied Noah's uncanny ability to see through adult pretenses to the truth beneath. Helen knelt down to Noah's eye level, her expensive clothes rustling softly against the polished floor. "You're very smart," she said, her voice gentler now, stripped of its earlier formality. "What else do you see?" The question seemed to unlock something in Noah, who stepped closer with the eagerness of a child, finally finding an adult willing to listen to his observations. He pointed toward room 314, where Rebecca Ashford lay surrounded by millions of dollars worth of medical technology. The machines continued their electronic chorus, creating a rhythm that had become as familiar as breathing to everyone who worked in this wing of the hospital. "The lady in there isn't really sleeping," Noah announced with the confidence of someone stating an obvious fact. "She's listening to everything, but nobody talks to her like she can hear them. They talk about her like she's not there, but her fingers move when they say her name." His small hand gestured toward the glass partition where the medical team had finally dispersed, leaving Rebecca alone with only the machines for company. The observation struck Daniel like a physical blow, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't realized he was trying to solve suddenly clicking into place with devastating clarity. Helen's face went ashen, all traces of color draining from her cheeks as Noah's words sank in. She pressed one hand against the wall to steady herself, her breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction, carrying instead the hollow sound of someone whose worst fears were being confirmed. The hospital's fluorescent lights seemed to flicker overhead, casting shifting shadows that made the corridor feel suddenly unstable, as if the very foundations of reality were shifting beneath their feet. Daniel watched Helen's reaction with growing alarm, recognizing the signs of someone confronting a truth they weren't prepared to face. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Daniel moved closer, ready to catch Helen if she collapsed. The woman's hands were shaking now, her carefully maintained composure crumbling like a house of cards in a hurricane. She fumbled in her purse for something, tissues, medication, or perhaps just the familiar comfort of a physical anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. The leather bag's contents scattered slightly as her trembling fingers searched through its depths, revealing glimpses of a life held together by careful organization and expensive accessories that couldn't protect against the kind of emotional devastation she was currently experiencing. "I'm Dr. Helen Patterson," she said finally, her professional title emerging like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person. "I specialize in psychological evaluation for patients with complex neurological conditions. I was brought in to assess Rebecca's mental state before her family makes certain decisions." The words came out in carefully measured phrases, as if she were reading from a medical textbook rather than describing a situation that was clearly tearing her apart from the inside. Daniel noticed how she avoided making eye contact, her gaze fixed on some point beyond his shoulder as she spoke. The confession hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, acrid and impossible to ignore. Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always accompanied moments when his old life as an engineer collided with his current reality as a custodian. "Doctor," he said carefully, "what kind of decisions?" The question emerged before he could stop himself, driven by an instinct he couldn't quite name, but had learned to trust over the years. Helen's eyes finally met his, and in them he saw a reflection of his own struggles with loss, responsibility, and the terrible weight of choices that could never be undone. Noah tugged at his father's sleeve with the persistence of a child who had noticed something important that the adults were missing. "Dad, the lady's name isn't really Patterson, is it?" His question cut through the tension like a scalpel through skin, precise and devastating in its simplicity. Helen's reaction was immediate and telling. She stepped backward as if the child had physically struck her, one hand rising to her throat in an unconscious gesture of protection. The hospital corridor seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the building itself was holding its breath in anticipation of whatever revelation was about to unfold. "How could you possibly know that?" Helen's voice cracked on the words, her professional demeanor finally abandoning her completely. She looked from Noah to Daniel and back again, searching their faces for some explanation that would make sense of a 6-year-old's impossible insight. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their electrical song joining the distant sounds of medical equipment and muffled conversations that filled every corner of St. Mary's Medical Center. Daniel felt the weight of his son's gift pressing down on him like a physical force, the same mixture of pride and terror that had defined his relationship with Noah's unique abilities since the boy was old enough to speak. "Noah sees patterns," Daniel explained, though he wasn't entirely sure he understood his son's reasoning himself. "He notices when things don't match up, when people's stories have holes in them." The boy nodded gravely, his tablet now forgotten, as he focused all his attention on Helen's increasingly distressed face. There was something almost hypnotic about Noah's steady gaze, the way he seemed to look through surface appearances to the essential truth beneath. It was a gift that had served him well in navigating a world designed for neurotypical children, but Daniel sometimes worried about the burden it placed on such young shoulders. Helen's composure finally shattered completely, tears spilling down her cheeks as she pressed both hands against her mouth to muffle the sound of her sobbing. The expensive makeup that had been so carefully applied began to run in dark streaks, creating abstract patterns that spoke of grief too long suppressed. "My real name," she whispered through her fingers, "is Helen Ashford. Rebecca is my sister. We haven't spoken in 15 years. The admission seemed to physically drain her, leaving her leaning against the hospital wall for support, as the full weight of her deception settled around them like fallout from an emotional explosion. Daniel felt the pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves in his mind, creating a picture that was both clearer and infinitely more complex than anything he had imagined. The family resemblance he had noticed earlier now made perfect sense, as did Helen's raw emotional reaction to Noah's observations about Rebecca's condition. 15 years, he repeated, testing the weight of that number against the evidence of Helen's obvious anguish. What happened 15 years ago? The question emerged gently, without pressure, but with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested he already suspected the answer would change everything. Our parents died in a car accident, Helen said, her voice hollow with old grief that had never properly healed. Rebecca was 19, I was 16. She inherited everything, the company, the house, the responsibility for taking care of me. But I thought she was trying to control my life, trying to keep me from being independent. She wiped at her tears with the back of her hand, smearing her makeup even further. I accused her of wanting to replace our parents, of treating me like a child who couldn't make her own decisions. The last thing I said to her was that I never wanted to see her again. The hospital corridor seemed to grow longer and more oppressive as Helen's story unfolded, each word adding weight to an already crushing burden of regret and missed opportunities. Daniel thought about his own son, about the protective instincts that drove him to shield Noah from a world that often seemed designed to hurt sensitive children. And now, he asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. Helen's laugh was bitter and broken, the sound of someone who had discovered too late that their carefully constructed defenses had been built against the wrong enemy. Now she's dying, and I don't even know if she'd want to see me if she could, Helen whispered. The family asked me to evaluate her psychological state because they don't know about our relationship. They think I'm just another doctor, someone objective who can help them decide whether to continue life support or... She couldn't finish the sentence, the implications too terrible to voice aloud. The fluorescent lights flickered again, casting dancing shadows that made the corridor feel unstable, as if the very foundations of the hospital were shifting beneath the weight of so much accumulated sorrow. Noah stepped closer to Helen, his small hand reaching out to touch her arm, with the gentle precision of someone who understood pain, even if he couldn't fully comprehend its source. "The lady in the room," he said softly. "She's waiting for someone. Her heart beats faster when people walk by, like she's hoping one of them will be the right person." His observation struck Helen like a physical blow, causing her to double over as if she'd been punched in the stomach. The child's innocent words carried implications too profound for his young mind to fully grasp, but their truth resonated through the sterile hospital air like the tolling of a bell. Daniel's cleaning cart sat forgotten in the corridor as he watched Helen struggle with the weight of Noah's revelation. The evening shift would be starting soon, bringing new faces and fresh tragedies to fill the rooms that never seemed to stay empty for long. But room 314 would remain unchanged, its occupant trapped in a twilight state between consciousness and oblivion, while her sister wrestled with 15 years of accumulated guilt and regret. "Dr. Patterson?" Daniel said gently, using her assumed name like a shield against the raw emotion crackling between them. "What exactly are you supposed to be evaluating? Whether she has any meaningful awareness." Helen replied, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Whether keeping her alive is prolonging her suffering or preserving hope for recovery. The family needs an expert opinion before they decide whether to authorize a DNR order." The medical terminology fell from her lips with practiced precision, but Daniel could hear the way each word cut into her like broken glass. She was being asked to play God with her own sister's life, to make a professional judgment about someone whose loss would destroy what remained of her fractured heart. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor, signaling the arrival of the evening medical team. Dr. Crawford emerged from the elevator with 2 specialists in tow, their white coats rustling softly as they moved with the purposeful stride of people accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. Helen immediately began composing herself, wiping away the remaining traces of tears and straightening her blazer with sharp, efficient movements. The transformation was remarkable. Within seconds, the grieving sister had disappeared, replaced by the cool professional who could discuss brain death and treatment options without revealing the personal stakes involved. "Dr. Patterson," Dr. Crawford nodded as he approached, his voice carrying the weary authority of someone who had spent too many years delivering bad news to desperate families. "Have you had a chance to observe the patient? We're hoping your psychological assessment might provide some insight that we've missed." He gestured toward room 314, where Rebecca lay surrounded by the electronic evidence of her body's stubborn refusal to surrender. The machines continued their monotonous chorus, creating a rhythm that had become the soundtrack to her family's vigil. Helen's mask of professional composure slipped for just a moment, revealing a glimpse of the anguish beneath. "I'd like to spend more time with her," she said carefully. "Perhaps try some different approaches to assess her level of awareness." The words were chosen with surgical precision, designed to buy time while revealing nothing of her true agenda. Daniel watched this performance with growing admiration and horror, recognizing the terrible skill required to maintain such deception while one's heart was breaking. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their electrical song joining the ambient noise of the hospital in a symphony of artificial life. "Of course," Dr. Crawford replied, already turning his attention to the charts in his hands. "Take all the time you need. We'll be meeting with the family tomorrow morning to discuss our options." The casual way he mentioned the meeting made Daniel's stomach clench with sympathetic dread. 24 hours. Helen had less than a day to decide whether her sister lived or died, whether 15 years of silence would end in reconciliation or eternal separation. The weight of that responsibility seemed to settle on her shoulders like a physical burden, causing her to sag slightly against the corridor wall. Noah tugged at his father's sleeve again, his young face serious with the kind of concentration he usually reserved for particularly complex puzzles. "Dad," he whispered, "what if the lady isn't really unconscious? What if she's just trapped inside her own head, and nobody knows how to help her get out?" The child's question hung in the air like a revelation, its implications spreading through Daniel's consciousness like ripples in still water. He thought about his own experiences with isolation, about the months after his wife's death, when he had felt trapped inside his own grief, unable to communicate his pain to a world that seemed determined to move forward without him. The medical team disappeared into room 314, their voices dropping to the hushed tones reserved for discussions of terminal diagnoses and end-of-life care. Through the glass partition, Daniel could see them examining Rebecca's motionless form, checking reflexes and reviewing data that would ultimately inform their recommendation to her family. Helen watched their movements with the intensity of someone observing a ritual that would determine her own fate, her hands pressed flat against the cool hospital wall, as if she could somehow absorb strength from its institutional solidity. "Locked-in syndrome," Daniel said suddenly, the words emerging from some half-remembered article he had read during the sleepless nights after his wife's accident. "It's rare, but it happens. Patients who appear unconscious but are actually aware of everything around them." Helen's head snapped toward him with startling intensity, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and terror. The possibility hung between them like a lifeline thrown to a drowning person, salvation and damnation wrapped in the same desperate chance. "That's what I've been afraid of," Helen whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the hospital. "What if she's been listening to everything we've said about her? What if she knows we're planning to let her die?" The questions tumbled from her lips with increasing urgency, each one adding weight to a burden that already seemed too heavy to bear. Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always accompanied moments when his old analytical skills brushed against the raw emotional realities of his current life. Noah stepped closer to the glass partition, pressing his small hands against the cool surface as he studied Rebecca's motionless form with the focused attention he usually reserved for particularly interesting mechanical systems. "She's trying to tell us something," he announced, with the confidence of someone stating an obvious fact. "Look at her fingers. They move in a pattern when people say certain words." His observation sent a chill down Daniel's spine, the same mixture of pride and terror he always felt when confronted with his son's extraordinary perceptual abilities. Helen rushed to the window, her breath fogging the glass as she pressed her face against its surface. "What kind of pattern?" she asked urgently, her professional training warring with her personal desperation. Noah pointed to Rebecca's right hand, where her index finger seemed to twitch almost imperceptibly whenever certain sounds penetrated the medical equipment's electronic chorus. The movement was so subtle that it could easily be dismissed as involuntary muscle spasms, but there was something about its timing that suggested intentionality, consciousness operating beneath the surface of apparent oblivion. "We have to tell Dr. Crawford," Helen said, but her voice lacked conviction, carrying instead the hollow sound of someone grasping at straws. Daniel could see the conflict playing out across her features, the trained professional who knew better than to read significance into random muscle movements, warring with the desperate sister willing to believe in any possibility that might preserve hope. The fluorescent lights flickered again, casting shifting shadows that made Rebecca's still form seem to move with phantom life. "Wait," Daniel said, his hand touching Helen's arm with gentle restraint. "If we're wrong, if it's just wishful thinking, then we've given false hope to a family that's already suffering. But if we're right..." He couldn't finish the sentence, the implications too enormous to voice aloud. Noah continued his vigil at the window, his young face pressed against the glass as he watched for signs that adults had trained themselves not to see. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, filled with the constant background symphony of human drama playing out behind closed doors. The evening shift change brought new faces and fresh energy to the intensive care unit. Nurses and orderlies moving with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to life and death routines. Daniel's replacement appeared at the far end of the corridor, pushing an identical cleaning cart and wearing the same anonymous uniform that rendered custodial staff invisible to most hospital visitors. The sight reminded Daniel of his own precarious position in this unfolding drama. He was supposed to be cleaning floors, not involving himself in medical mysteries that were far above his pay grade. "I have an idea," Helen said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of desperate determination. "What if we try talking to her directly? Not about her, not around her, but to her. If she really is conscious, if she's been listening to everything." The suggestion hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that were both terrifying and wonderful. Daniel thought about his own son's need for direct communication, the way Noah responded better to honest conversation than to the careful euphemisms adults usually employed when discussing difficult topics. Noah nodded gravely, as if Helen had finally suggested something that made perfect sense to him. "People always talk about sick people like they can't hear," he observed with the blunt honesty that made adults uncomfortable. "But when I was in the hospital after Mom died, I could hear everything, even when I pretended to be asleep." The admission struck Daniel like a physical blow, reminding him of his own failures during those dark months when grief had made him temporarily unavailable to his son's emotional needs. The medical team emerged from room 314, their consultation apparently complete for the evening. Dr. Crawford paused to speak with Helen, his voice carrying the weary authority of someone delivering routine updates about hopeless cases. "No change in her condition," he reported. "We'll continue monitoring through the night, but I'm afraid the prognosis remains unchanged. The family meeting is scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow." His words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of finality that seemed to spread through the corridor's sterile atmosphere. Helen nodded with professional composure, but Daniel could see the way her hands trembled as she clutched her purse strap. "Doctor," she said carefully, "I'd like to try some unconventional assessment techniques tonight, if that's acceptable." Sometimes breakthrough moments happen when we least expect them. The request was phrased with just enough medical authority to sound reasonable, but Daniel could hear the desperation beneath its clinical language. Dr. Crawford's expression suggested mild skepticism, but he was too tired to argue with a specialist who might provide the miracle they all secretly hoped for. "Of course," he replied, already moving toward the elevator with the rest of his team. "Just make sure to document any observations for tomorrow's meeting." The casual way he mentioned documentation made Daniel's stomach clench with sympathetic dread. Helen would be required to provide written evidence of her sister's condition, professional opinions that would be used to justify decisions about life and death. The weight of that responsibility seemed to settle on her shoulders like a physical burden, causing her to sag slightly against the corridor wall. As soon as the medical team disappeared into the elevator, Helen's professional mask cracked completely, revealing the raw anguish beneath. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks despite her efforts to maintain composure. "What if I'm wrong? What if she really is brain dead, and I'm just seeing what I want to see?" The questions tumbled from her lips with increasing urgency, each one adding weight to a burden that already seemed too heavy to bear. Daniel felt the familiar surge of protective instinct that his son's vulnerability always triggered, recognizing in Helen the same desperate need for hope that had sustained him through his own darkest moments. Noah stepped between them with the matter-of-fact authority of a child who had decided that adults were making things unnecessarily complicated. "Why don't we just ask her?" he suggested, his voice carrying the kind of simple logic that often cut through adult anxiety like a knife through butter. "If she can hear us, then talking to her won't hurt anything. And if she can't, then at least we tried." The profound simplicity of his solution hung in the air like a revelation, stripping away the layers of professional protocol and emotional complexity to reveal the essential truth beneath. Helen's tear-stained face transformed with something that might have been hope, her eyes meeting Daniel's with a mixture of gratitude and terror. "Your son is remarkable," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "Will you help me? I don't think I can face this alone." The request carried implications that went far beyond the immediate situation. Acknowledgement of shared humanity in a place designed to reduce people to medical conditions and statistical probabilities. Daniel thought about his own journey through grief and recovery, about the unexpected kindness of strangers who had helped him rebuild his life after loss, had torn it apart. The intensive care unit settled into its evening rhythm as regular visiting hours ended and the hospital prepared for the long night ahead. Emergency lighting cast softer shadows through the corridors, creating an atmosphere that felt more intimate than the harsh fluorescent glare of daytime medical procedures. Room 314 remained brightly lit, its occupant surrounded by machines that continued their electronic vigil with tireless dedication. Helen approached the door with trembling hands, her breath fogging the glass as she pressed her face against its cool surface. "Rebecca," she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the hushed atmosphere of the intensive care unit. "It's Helen. Your little sister. I know you probably don't want to see me after all these years, but I'm here." The word seemed to cost her everything, each syllable extracted from depths of grief and regret that had been carefully sealed away for 15 years. Daniel watched from the corridor, Noah's small hand warm in his own, both of them witnesses to a reconciliation that might be happening entirely in Helen's imagination. But then Rebecca's finger moved. Not the random twitch they had observed earlier, but a deliberate pattern. 2 quick movements followed by a pause, then 3 more in rapid succession. Noah's grip on his father's hand tightened with excitement, his young face pressed against the glass as he tracked the subtle movements with the focused attention he usually reserved for particularly complex mechanical systems. "She's trying to answer," he announced with the confidence of someone who had finally solved a puzzle that had been bothering him for hours. Helen's breath caught in her throat as she watched her sister's finger continue its careful pattern, the movements too purposeful to be dismissed as random muscle spasms. "Rebecca, if you can hear me, move your finger once for yes," she said, her voice stronger now, infused with desperate hope. The response was immediate and unmistakable, a single deliberate movement that seemed to echo through the sterile room like a thunderclap. Helen's knees buckled, and she had to brace herself against the doorframe to keep from falling, as the full implications of her sister's response crashed over her like a wave. "Oh, God!" Helen sobbed, pressing both hands against the glass as if she could somehow reach through it to touch her sister's face. "Rebecca, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for everything I said, for staying away, for not being here when you needed me." The words poured from her in a torrent of accumulated guilt and grief, 15 years of suppressed emotion finally finding voice in the antiseptic silence of the intensive care unit. Daniel felt his own eyes burning with sympathetic tears, remembering his own desperate conversations with his unconscious wife during her final hours in a room very much like this one. Noah tugged at his father's sleeve with increasing urgency, his young face serious with the kind of concentration he usually reserved for particularly important discoveries. "Dad," he whispered, "we have to tell someone. The doctors need to know she's awake inside." His observation carried implications that seemed to expand like ripples in still water, touching every aspect of the medical and legal decisions that hung over Rebecca's care. If she was truly conscious, if she had been aware of every conversation about ending her life support, then everything changed in ways that Daniel's mind could barely begin to process. The weight of that responsibility seemed to settle on Daniel's shoulders like a physical burden, reminding him of his own professional past, when split-second decisions could mean the difference between successful flights and catastrophic failures. "Helen," he said gently, "we need to document this. We need witnesses, medical professionals who can verify what we're seeing." His words carried the careful precision of someone who understood the difference between hope and evidence, between wishful thinking and scientific proof. Helen nodded through her tears, her trained professional mind already beginning to reassert itself despite the emotional chaos of the moment. "You're right," she said, wiping at her tears with the back of her hand. "We need Dr. Crawford. We need the neurological team. We need proper testing equipment." But even as she spoke, her eyes remained fixed on her sister's face, searching for additional signs of consciousness beneath the artificial stillness imposed by medical intervention. The machines continued their electronic chorus, creating a rhythm that had become the soundtrack to Rebecca's imprisonment in her own body. Daniel thought about his son's daily struggles with communication, about the frustration of being misunderstood or dismissed by people who couldn't see past surface appearances to the intelligence beneath. The corridor outside room 314 felt charged with electricity as Helen pulled out her cell phone with trembling fingers. "Dr. Crawford?" she said when the call connected, her voice struggling to maintain professional composure. "I need you to return to the ICU immediately. I believe Rebecca Ashford may be experiencing locked-in syndrome. We need to conduct immediate neurological assessments." The words tumbled from her lips with increasing urgency, each one carrying implications that would reshape everything they thought they knew about Rebecca's condition and prognosis. 20 minutes later, the intensive care unit buzzed with activity as medical personnel responded to Helen's urgent summons. Dr. Crawford arrived with a neurologist and 2 nurses, their faces reflecting skepticism, tempered by professional obligation to investigate any possibility of misdiagnosis. The corridor filled with hushed conversations and the rustle of medical equipment being wheeled into position, creating an atmosphere of controlled urgency that reminded Daniel of aircraft maintenance crews responding to in-flight emergencies. Through the glass partition, Rebecca remained motionless, except for the subtle movements of her right index finger, which continued its careful pattern whenever familiar voices penetrated the mechanical sound of life support. The neurological assessment began with basic responsiveness tests, Dr. Crawford speaking directly to Rebecca while monitoring her vital signs for any indication of conscious awareness. "Rebecca, if you can hear me, try to move your right index finger," he instructed, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to invest too much hope in long-shot possibilities. The response was immediate and unmistakable, a single deliberate movement that registered on the monitoring equipment as a distinct neurological event rather than random muscle activity. Helen stood frozen in the corner of the room, her hands pressed against her mouth to stifle the sobs that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained professional composure. Noah watched from the corridor, his young face pressed against the glass as he observed the unfolding drama with the focused attention he usually reserved for particularly complex mechanical systems. Daniel felt his own heart pounding with sympathetic tension, remembering his own desperate vigils beside hospital beds, where hope and despair battled for dominance over medical reality. "This is extraordinary," the neurologist murmured, adjusting his equipment to capture more detailed readings of Rebecca's responses. "She's demonstrating clear cognitive awareness, despite presenting symptoms that suggested complete unresponsiveness." His words carried the careful excitement of a scientist confronting evidence that challenged established understanding, professional curiosity warring with human amazement at the resilience of consciousness trapped beneath layers of medical complexity. The machines registered each of Rebecca's responses with electronic precision, creating a digital record of awareness that had been hiding in plain sight for 72 hours. Dr. Crawford's expression shifted from skepticism to wonder as the evidence mounted, each test revealing new depths of consciousness beneath Rebecca's apparent catatonia. "How long has she been like this?" he asked Helen, his voice carrying implications that seemed to expand like shock waves through the sterile room. "If she's been aware this entire time, if she's heard every conversation about discontinuing life support." He couldn't finish the sentence, the ethical implications too profound to voice aloud in the presence of someone who might be listening to every word. "We need to establish a communication system immediately," Helen said, her professional training finally overriding her emotional turmoil. "Basic yes-no responses, perhaps more complex codes as we learn her capabilities." She moved closer to her sister's bedside, tears streaming down her face as 15 years of separation collapsed into a single moment of desperate connection. "Rebecca, I know you're angry with me. I know I hurt you terribly when I left, but I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere until we figure this out together." The response was immediate and heartbreaking, a complex series of finger movements that spoke of consciousness struggling against the boundaries of physical limitation. Noah pressed closer to the glass, his young mind working to decode the patterns he was observing with the same intensity he brought to solving mechanical puzzles. "She's trying to spell something," he announced with the confidence of someone who had finally cracked a code that had been bothering him for hours. "Look at the way she moves her finger. It's like she's writing letters in the air." The medical team gathered around Rebecca's bedside as Helen worked to establish more sophisticated communication protocols, their earlier skepticism replaced by growing amazement at the depth of awareness they were uncovering. Each test revealed new evidence of a fully conscious mind trapped within a body that appeared completely unresponsive to conventional medical assessment. The implications stretched far beyond Rebecca's individual case, touching fundamental questions about consciousness, medical diagnosis, and the ethical frameworks that governed end-of-life care decisions. "The family meeting," Dr. Crawford said suddenly, his voice heavy with the weight of near-catastrophic mistake they had almost made. "We were going to recommend discontinuing life support in 12 hours. The admission hung in the sterile air like a confession, acknowledgement of how close they had come to ending the life of someone who was fully aware of their intentions. Helen's face went pale as the implications sank in, her hands trembling as she contemplated a world where Noah's perceptive abilities had not led them to this discovery in time. Rebecca's finger movements became more agitated as she apparently understood the conversation taking place around her bedside, her attempts at communication growing more desperate as the reality of her situation became clear. "It's all right," Helen whispered, taking her sister's hand in both of hers. "You're safe now. We know you're here. We know you're listening. No one is going to make any decisions without talking to you first." The words seemed to calm Rebecca's movements, her finger relaxing into a steadier pattern that spoke of relief mixed with exhaustion from the effort of making herself understood. The intensive care unit settled into a new rhythm as the medical team worked to establish more sophisticated communication methods and reassess Rebecca's condition in light of their groundbreaking discovery. Helen remained at her sister's bedside, their hands intertwined despite 15 years of separation and accumulated misunderstanding. Daniel and Noah watched from the corridor, both of them witnesses to a miracle that had emerged from the intersection of professional expertise and childhood perception, scientific training, and intuitive understanding. "Dad," Noah said softly, his young voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned important truths about the power of really seeing other people. "Do you think she'll get better now that everyone knows she's awake inside?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, touching hopes and fears that extended far beyond the medical complexities of Rebecca's specific condition. Daniel thought about his own journey through grief and recovery, about the unexpected ways that human connection could illuminate paths through seemingly impossible darkness. "I don't know, son," Daniel replied honestly, his hand resting on Noah's shoulder as they continued their vigil outside room 314. "But now she has something she didn't have before. She has people who know she's there, people who are listening to what she's trying to say." Through the glass partition, they could see Helen leaning close to her sister's face, their conversation too quiet to overhear, but intense with the weight of 15 years' worth of accumulated words that had never been spoken. The hospital corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, filled with the constant background symphony of human drama playing out behind closed doors. But room 314 had been transformed from a place of ending into a space of beginning, where consciousness had emerged from apparent oblivion, and where two sisters were rebuilding a relationship that had been shattered by misunderstanding and pride. Daniel thought about his own relationships, about the fragility of human connection, and the importance of really seeing the people who mattered most in his life. As the night shift settled into its rhythm around them, Daniel knew that their lives had been permanently changed by the events of this evening. Noah had discovered the power of his unique perceptual gifts to make a difference in other people's. While Helen had found her way back to a sister she thought she had lost forever. And Rebecca, trapped for 3 days in a nightmare of conscious paralysis, finally had people who understood that she was still there, still fighting, still hoping for a future that extended beyond the mechanical rhythms of life support equipment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their electrical song joining the ambient noise of the hospital in a symphony of artificial life that had become the soundtrack to thousands of human stories playing out in rooms just like this one. But tonight, in room 314, that soundtrack had changed from a dirge into something that sounded remarkably like hope, carried on the wings of a 6-year-old boy's extraordinary ability to see what others had missed, and a janitor's willingness to trust his son's unique vision of the world.